Okay, hi. I am going to get started, and if you have questions as I go along, please don't hesitate to unmute and say something. A lot of what I'm presenting today are things that may seem easy enough, but we get a lot of questions on them, and we've had a lot of people get into like hot water over some of this stuff, specifically around notice of defects, just because we haven't had to deal with them very much in the last several years when we had really competitive offers and either no inspections, or super high thresholds for those. So, um, here we go. Okay, so the first thing I want to outline is just the difference between an amendment and a notice. We get this question pretty frequently. So an amendment is something that needs to be signed by both parties. It has to be agreed upon by two different people. So this would be if you're changing the inspection deadline, or there needs to be fixes done at the house. Everybody needs to sign the amendment. It has to be done by an amendment. It cannot be a notice. A notice is something that you would just use to notify somebody that something's occurring, but is not necessarily required for all parties to sign. For instance, a notice can be used when someone's providing a loan commitment letter to the seller. The notice could just be used saying, like, the buyer has given permission for the buyer's agent to provide this loan commitment to satisfy the contingency. The biggest reason we would use a notice in an inspection would be if we're serving a notice of defect. And that would be then when you send that notice, it would, trigger the next contractual step. So in that case, it would either void the contract if the seller does not have the right to cure, or it would activate the seller opting to cure and that timeline on whether or not they will be doing the cure or not. So if a buyer uses an amendment to negotiate repairs or concessions and the seller refuses to sign the amendment, then nothing changes. So we get a lot of people who will not understand that that's the case. And obviously, the inspection deadline is, let's say it's on June 3rd. If you don't have something agreed upon before midnight on June 3rd, it will automatically waive itself. So you either have to have an amendment signed by all parties, or you need to serve a notice of defect before that inspection deadline is up. Um, so that's something that we've had a lot of people not fully understanding in the last 6 months, I'd say. So that's something to definitely be aware of and have handled before that deadline. Um, and when I do an amendment for inspection negotiations, I always only give it through like 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. on that day so that I know what I'm doing. If I'm going to be serving a notice of defect, I've been up in my bed at 10 p.m. waiting to see if they're going to sign something. Um, and it's not a good time. Um, so again, if you serve the notice, if they have the right to cure, the amount of time that you have written into the right to cure language in the offer will start at that point. The default is 10 days. I often will make it much shorter, like 3 days. I feel like the seller should know very well at that point if they're going to do it or not, and it just makes things go a lot faster. So that's always a tip that I like to give, is shorten up that time. If the seller doesn't have the right to cure, it's automatically null and void. The problem with giving the right to cure, and now that the market's kind of evening out somewhat, is that you don't get to dictate how that fix is made. So it's easier if you can figure out an amendment and or not give the right to cure if you're not in competition. So recently we had someone who had an inspection set up and they couldn't get an inspector in time. So always remember when you're setting the deadlines to make sure that you think that the inspection can be done, that you have time to look the findings over and some sort of negotiation before that deadline is up. Um, I'll go over this later, but they were trying to fall back on the addendum AC, and that's not something that you can do to extend a deadline, like on one side. So I'll talk about that again in just a few minutes. But the other thing we run across is people not providing copies of the inspection or testing report to the seller. Um, Under the WB11, it is required that we promptly provide copies of those to the inspection or to the listing agent. Usually whenever I get it, I just forward it on and say, I'll be speaking with my clients, something along those lines. But then you know that you've given it to them promptly and they can't say otherwise. Um, the other important thing is if you are serving a notice of defect, even if you've already sent the inspection report, automatically that first time, you need to attach the inspection report to that notice of defects as well in order for it to be whole. We have a lot of waiving inspections. It's just been the nature of the game over the last few years, several years, I guess, at this point. Make sure that you've educated the client on what that means and make sure that you have them sign off on that. So there's two ways to do that, the Keller Williams Zip Forms library, or you can use pre-written clause language that's also in Zip Forms. So on the upper right-hand side of Zip Forms, if you hit the drop down, it should offer clause library. And there's a clause in there that talks about, my agent has spoken to me about the risks of not having a home inspection, that type of thing. So either put that in the offer or use the specified form. I think it's called the Waiver of Home Inspection, and that's in the library of actual forms in Zip Forms. So this is protecting you. If someone comes back later and they're like, well, I didn't have an inspection and you should have told me that I needed to have one XYZ, whatever, you're covering yourself that you had them sign off that they understood what the risk was. So the inspection contingency does refer to just a generalized home inspection. If there are specific items of concern that aren't necessarily covered in what we would consider a general home inspection, I would write it right up front into that inspection piece. So, for instance, I had one recently. It was like a 90-year-old house. There were very clearly some issues in the basement. There was like one beam holding the entire house up, kind of in the middle of the house, and it was a large place. So we went ahead right away and just wrote that we wanted a structural engineer to come in. We wrote that in our offer to start because we wanted to make sure that even if the inspector didn't necessarily suggest a structural engineer, that we would have the ability to do that. Another one that comes up is swimming pools or maybe exterior buildings, a barn or something. Maybe someone's like super, interested in and wanting to know the condition of. Definitely write those in off the bat. It's much easier to ask for it at the front than it is when you're trying to negotiate. So that's definitely something to keep in mind and use. Follow-up inspections are allowed. They do need to let you in as a buyer's agent to have those follow-up inspections if they're recommended in writing from an authorized inspector and it's before the deadline. So this addendum AC caveat is what I was kind of alluding to earlier. So in this instance, the agent did not have enough time or whatever it was to have an inspector through. So they served a notice because in the addendum AC, it's checked off that someone can serve a notice to extend the inspection for follow-up inspections. So she's like, well, we didn't get to have the inspection, so here's the notice. I'm extending it the 3 days that we agreed upon. That does not work for the typical generalized home inspection. So in order for that to come into play and a notice to be sufficient in that specific situation, you have to have had the home inspection where they recommend follow-up inspections. So the language in the addendum AC is very clear that it's for follow-up inspections. So never fall back on that if you have an addendum AC and you're like, well, I can send a notice over. I don't need to get them to agree to it. In that case, an amendment would need to be done because it is the extension of the general home inspection. There are some gray areas that we run across regularly in terms of what people can have done. One of them being a sewer scope. So a sewer scope So testing, obviously, if you want testing done, you need to mark that in the offer. And testing is going to be like mold, asbestos, kind of the things that we, I guess, first think of when we're doing testing. But the things that aren't really outlined in the offer or anything we have is the sewer scoping or like sewer issues or drain tile testing. So a sewer scope, according to the WRA, does not qualify as a test unless there's a sample taken from the scope. So the test definition is a sample is being taken from the home. So lead-based paint, mold, that kind of stuff. The scope can be performed by a third party inspector if it's suggested in writing by the initial inspector. So if they're finding something going on and they're like, you really need to get this scoped, you should be able to have that sewer scope done because it is not a test. It is just another thing, another inspection that the inspector is suggesting. Um, and then the drain tile test is another thing that we run across a lot because it has the word test in it, but it is not taking a sample and it's not considered a test, like the other ones we would consider testing. But because it's kind of ambiguous, it can be hard to argue. So and part of it is that they drill holes into the drain tile, which, obviously kind of changes the house to some degree. So it can be more of a gray area. And so if there is some sort of disagreement, whether the seller is like, I'm not letting you in to do that. And, the buyer is like, we need to do this. And, I'm not moving forward until we do, then that's when you need to get legal counsel involved because this is a gray area and both points could be argued. So the inspectors, as of, I don't even remember how long now, maybe 8 years, they've had to start writing. Ideally, they should be putting like defect, safety items, monitor in their inspection reports. So if an inspector has labeled something as a defect in the report, the buyer can object to that condition. However, it doesn't mean that that's the only thing a buyer can object to. They can object to other things, even if they aren't labeled as defect, as long as they meet the definition of the defect in the offer to purchase. So what I kind of wrote in here again was just the defect definition, which I try to basically memorize and rattle off to people when we're talking about inspections and negotiating and all of that stuff. So it's something that would have a significant adverse effect on the value of property, significantly impair health, safety of future occupants, or if not repaired, removed, or replaced, would shorten the or adversely affect the expected normal life of the premises. So, a lot of times like electrical stuff sometimes isn't necessarily put into defect, but I feel like that can obviously be argued because it could be a fire issue, which could be a huge safety or health concern, things like that. So it's not to say that you can't use items that are not explicitly labeled defect in the inspection report, which I think some people get hung up on. But it's also, prudent to kind of reread the definition and kind of figure out what works within that definition when you're serving a notice of defects, mainly just to make the strongest argument as well. So another thing that comes up pretty frequently is if there's something that's noted in the inspection report, the way that the offer reads is that defects don't include structural, mechanical, or other conditions to the nature and extent of which a buyer had actual knowledge or written notice prior to signing the offer. So that includes and is most explicitly directed toward the condition report. So if a seller writes in, there are cracks in the basement or something along those lines, very vague. If the inspection report describes a condition beyond what was disclosed in the real estate condition report, a buyer's notice could be effective in the notice of defects. However, if the seller's description is pretty spot on as to what the inspector's report detailed, then the buyer cannot issue a notice of defect. This is again something that it's very likely you'll need to include legal counsel in, but according to the WRA, the argument could be made that, if it was just a super vague, like tiny thing that ended up being a much larger thing that like no one would have known about based on that little description in the real estate condition report, that it could be used in an effective notice of defects way. But again, this is kind of one of those gray areas. This is just kind of generally speaking and kind of what the WRA typically advises on. Does anyone have any specific questions or things that have come up with you or anything like that? Anything that sparked an idea while I was going through things? Okay.
I
Kathy?
have a quick, yes, I have a quick question. Um, what is best practices for um, when you're writing a contingency for home inspection? I don't know the exact wording, but it's like the buyer will cover up to $1,000 on defects. After that, we'll negotiate. I know I'm kind of saying it in layman's
Sure.
terms, but what is the best practice to follow up on something like that?
So that's typically where you'll write in the addendum AC that verbiage most of the
Hmm.
time. So that's the best way. It does, that's kind of where you can write in if you want to get like other inspections done, basically saying like then you're able to have people in to get quotes for items. So that way you can show like, hey, this is $5,000, not $1,000, and then you can talk about negotiating that excess. That's why that's kind of written the way it is, and that's kind of mainly the intention behind it.
Thank you.
Hmm. Okay. Well, thanks again, everyone, for coming. If you need anything further, you all know where to find me, and I hope you have a great day.